Flanders in 1917 was not wilderness. For centuries, Belgian farmers had fought the water. They built drainage ditches, canals, and dikes across the lowlands between Ypres and the ridges beyond. The land sat barely above sea level. Without constant maintenance, the fields would revert to marsh. The system worked because it was continuous. Water moved through channels, away from the soil, toward the coast. Artillery destroyed that system in 4 days. When Field Marshal Douglas Haig ordered the Third Battle of Ypres to begin on July 31st, 1917, British gunners had already fired over 4 million shells into the Flanders plain. Each explosion ruptured drainage channels. Each crater became a reservoir. The soil, already saturated from weeks of rain, lost its ability to absorb water. Shell holes filled within hours. The ground between them turned to porridge. By August 2nd, the battlefield was no longer solid. German engineers had anticipated this. Reports from the 4th Army headquarters described the defensive strategy clearly. Allow the British artillery to destroy the drainage, then wait for the infantry to advance into the swamp. Pillboxes of the Flandernse Stellung had been positioned on whatever high ground existed. German machine gun crews watched from concrete as British soldiers struggled through waist-deep mud below them. The rain continued through August. Philip Gibbs, the British war correspondent embedded with the 5th Army, described the landscape in his dispatch of August 10th. The ground is a porridge of mud. Men are sinking up to their waists within yards of the support trenches. Whole sections have disappeared into shell holes. The wounded cannot be carried back. They drown before the stretcher bearers can reach them. This was not hyperbole. Medical officers attached to the 48th Division recorded that over 60% of casualties during the second week of August drowned before reaching aid stations. The ground had liquefied. What had been farmland was now a series of interconnected craters, each filled with water, separated by ridges of churned earth that collapsed under the weight of a man. British artillery observers noted that shells fired into the mud often failed to detonate. They sank into the liquid soil and vanished. When they did explode, they threw geysers of water and mud 30 feet into the air. The craters they created immediately filled with groundwater. Within an hour, there was no evidence a shell had landed there at all. The battlefield was digesting its own destruction. The 1st Australian Division attacked toward West Hook Ridge on August 10, 1917. The objective was a series of German pillboxes along a low rise northeast of Ypres. The Australians moved forward at dawn. Within 20 minutes, officers reported that the advance had slowed to a crawl. Men were sinking into the mud up to their knees. The barrage had moved ahead of them. German machine guns opened fire. Captain Frank Hurley, an Australian photographer attached to the division, recorded the scene from a forward observation post. His notes describe men attempting to cross a flooded creek bed near the Steenbeek. They used duckboards laid across the water. German artillery struck the crossing point. The duckboards shattered. Men fell into the water. Those who tried to climb out found the banks had turned to slurry. They could not gain purchase. Hurley watched 6 men drown in water less than 5 feet deep. They could not lift themselves out of the mud on the bottom. The 2nd Australian Division, attacking to the south, reported similar conditions. Companies became separated within minutes of leaving their trenches. The mud pulled at their legs with every step. Equipment became unbearable. Men began discarding packs, ammunition, even rifles, trying to lighten themselves. Battalion commanders lost contact with their forward units. Runners sent back to headquarters never arrived. Some were killed by shellfire. Others simply vanished into the craters. Private Donald Fraser of the 31st Canadian Battalion, stationed in reserve, described watching the Australian attack from a support trench. They looked like men wading through glue. Every step was an effort. You could see them pulling their legs free, one at a time, and then sinking again. Some of them just stopped moving. They stood there in the mud, too exhausted to continue, and waited for the shells to find them. The German 4th Army War Diary for August 10th records the Australian attack as largely neutralised by terrain conditions. Machine gun crews in the pillboxes reported that the attackers presented stationary targets. Men advancing through the mud could not take cover. They could not run. They moved at walking pace, fully exposed, while German gunners fired belt after belt into them. By nightfall, the 1st and 2nd Australian divisions had advanced approximately 400 yards. Casualty figures exceeded 5,000 men. Over 1,200 were listed as missing. Most of them had drowned in shell holes or been buried alive when artillery struck the mud around them. Their bodies were never recovered. Lieutenant Hugh Quigley of the Canadian Corps witnessed the drowning of Corporal James Mackenzie on October 28, 1917, near Passchendaele village. Quigley's account, recorded in his memoir Passchendaele and the Somme, describes the incident in precise detail. Mackenzie had been moving forward with a platoon along a duckboard track when German artillery struck the position. The concussion threw him off the boards and into a shell hole. The hole was approximately 12 feet across and filled with water to a depth Quigley estimated at 7 feet. Mackenzie surfaced immediately. He was not wounded. He began swimming toward the edge of the crater. The mud around the rim prevented him from climbing out. His hands could find no solid ground. Each time he tried to pull himself up, the edge collapsed and slid back into the water. 3 men from his section reached the crater and attempted to pull him free. They lay on their stomachs and extended their rifles toward him. Mackenzie grabbed the barrel of one rifle and held on. The man holding the rifle began to pull. Mackenzie rose partway out of the water, then his tunic tore. He slipped back into the crater. The soldiers tried again, this time throwing him a rope salvaged from a supply wagon. Mackenzie tied the rope around his chest. 4 men pulled. The rope cut into his flesh. He screamed. They pulled harder. The rope snapped. Quigley ordered his men to find a longer rope and something to use as an anchor point. They searched the area for 15 minutes. When they returned to the crater, Mackenzie was floating face down in the water. Exhaustion had taken him. Quigley wrote, "We left him there. There was no means to recover his body. The hole was too deep and the mud too soft. He remains in that crater to this day." This was not an isolated incident. Medical reports from the 3rd Canadian Division document over 200 drowning deaths during the advance on Passchendaele between October 26th and November 10th. The division's war diary notes that recovery of wounded from shell holes is impossible in the majority of cases due to ground conditions. Stretcher bearers attached to the Royal Army Medical Corps submitted testimony describing their attempts to rescue men from the craters. Bearer Thomas Williamson, serving with the 5th Division, recorded an attempt to save a wounded lance corporal near Polygon Wood. The man had been hit by shrapnel and had fallen into a crater. He was conscious and calling for help. Williamson and 3 other bearers reached the edge of the hole. They lowered a stretcher into the water, hoping the wounded man could climb onto it. He tried. His legs would not support his weight. He sank into the mud at the bottom of the crater. The bearers could see him beneath the surface, struggling. They extended poles into the water. He grabbed one. They pulled. His hands slipped off. He surfaced once more, gasped, and went under. Williamson wrote, "He drowned while we stood watching. We could not reach him. The mud held him like a vice." German accounts describe similar horrors. A report from a Marine Division machine gun crew stationed near Gravenstaffel Ridge tells of a British soldier trapped in a shell hole directly in front of their position. The man had been there for 2 days. He was sinking gradually. The machine gunners could hear him calling out. They could not retrieve him without exposing themselves to British fire. On the 3rd day, he stopped calling. On the 4th day, only his helmet remained visible above the water. The Canadian Corps entered the Passchendaele sector on October 18, 1917. They relieved the exhausted remnants of the British 5th Army. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, commanding the Canadians, inspected the battlefield before committing his divisions to the attack. His report to Field Marshal Haig was unambiguous. "The ground is impassable. Any attack will result in enormous casualties for negligible gain." Haig ordered the attack to proceed. The Canadian Corps would take Passchendaele Ridge. Currie assigned the 3rd and 4th Canadian Divisions to the assault. Both divisions were at full strength. They had been resting in reserve for 3 weeks. Their men were fresh. They were about to enter the worst ground on the Western Front. The 3rd Canadian Division attacked on October 26th. The objective was a line of German pillboxes along the Bellevue Spur. The division's war diary records that the advance began at 5:40 a.m. in darkness and rain. Within 30 minutes, battalion commanders reported that men were sinking into the mud up to their thighs. The barrage moved forward on schedule. The infantry could not keep pace. Private Donald Fraser, now serving with the 31st Battalion in the assault wave, described the advance in his diary. "We moved forward into water, not trenches, not mud, water. It was up to our waists in places. You couldn't see shell holes because the whole battlefield was one continuous swamp. Men vanished. You would be walking beside someone, you would look away, and when you looked back they were gone, sunk into a crater you didn't know was there." The 4th Canadian Division, attacking to the north, encountered the same conditions. The division's medical officer reported that casualties were drowning faster than they could be evacuated. Stretcher bearers could not move through the mud while carrying wounded men. The wounded were being left in shell holes, propped against the edges, waiting for bearers who never arrived. Major Georges Vanier, commanding a company in the Royal 22nd Regiment, recorded that his unit lost 60 men in the first hour of the attack without encountering German resistance. They drowned, collapsed from exhaustion, or were buried when shells exploded in the mud near them. Vanier wrote, "The ground was killing us faster than the enemy." The Canadian artillery, attempting to support the advance, found their guns sinking into the mud. Battery positions established the night before had subsided by morning. Guns tilted at impossible angles. Crews dug them out, only to watch them sink again. Ammunition could not be brought forward. The roads had dissolved. Horses drowned attempting to pull wagons through the swamp. Supply columns abandoned equipment and retreated. By the afternoon of October 26th, the 3rd Canadian Division had advanced approximately 300 yards. Over 800 men were dead or missing. The 4th Division, fighting through the same swamp to the north, reported similar losses. German machine gun fire from the pillboxes had been steady and accurate. The Canadians could not maneuver. They could only wade forward in straight lines, fully exposed, while German gunners cut them down. The attack resumed on October 30th. The 3rd and 4th Divisions attacked again, this time reinforced by fresh battalions. The rain had continued. The battlefield had worsened. Duckboard tracks, laid by Royal Engineers the previous week, had sunk into the mud or been destroyed by shell fire. Men moving forward had no solid paths. They walked through open swamp, hoping the ground would hold. It did not hold. Companies disappeared into craters. Whole platoons were swallowed by the mud. Officers reported men screaming for help from shell holes, but rescue attempts failed repeatedly. The mud gripped the bodies of trapped soldiers and would not release them. Men trying to pull their comrades free found themselves sinking. They had to abandon the rescue or drown alongside the men they were trying to save. The 3rd Canadian Division reached the outskirts of Passchendaele village on November 6th. The advance had taken 11 days and cost over 4,000 casualties. Of those, nearly half were listed as missing. Their bodies were never found. They remain in the mud. The German 4th Army had constructed the Flandern Eye Stellung with the mud in mind. Pillboxes were built on the rare patches of elevated ground. Their walls were concrete, 8 feet thick, reinforced with steel. They were designed to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. They were not designed to withstand flooding. A report from Reserve Infantry Regiment 233, defending the sector near Gravenstaffel, describes conditions inside a pillbox designated Strong Point Albrecht during the first week of November 1917. The position housed a machine gun crew of 8 men and a garrison of 12 riflemen. The pillbox sat on what had been a slight rise in the ground. 4 days of rain had turned the rise into an island. Water surrounded the structure on all sides. The garrison could not leave. Movement outside the pillbox meant wading through chest-deep water under British artillery fire. Supply runners had stopped coming. The last ration delivery had been 3 days earlier. The men inside were reduced to eating emergency iron rations. Water seeped through cracks in the concrete floor. The interior of the pillbox was flooded to a depth of 6 inches. On November 3rd, a British shell struck the pillbox directly. The concrete held, but the concussion caused a section of the rear wall to crack. Water began pouring through the gap. The garrison attempted to plug the crack with sandbags. The water pressure was too great. Within 2 hours, the water inside the pillbox had risen to 18 inches. Equipment floated. Ammunition boxes were submerged. The machine gun crew elevated their weapon onto an improvised platform built from wooden ammunition crates. They continued firing at Canadian infantry advancing across the swamp in front of them. The water continued to rise. By evening, it was at knee height. The the garrison commander sent a runner to battalion headquarters requesting permission to abandon the position. The runner never arrived. On November 4th, a Canadian artillery barrage struck the area around Strongpoint Albrecht. One shell penetrated the pillbox through the damaged rear wall. It exploded inside. The report from Reserve Infantry Regiment 233 states that the explosion killed 4 men instantly. The blast ruptured the floor of the pillbox. Water from the flooded ground beneath surged upward. The interior filled rapidly. The survivors attempted to escape through the firing slits. The slits were too narrow. Men became wedged. They drowned trapped halfway through the openings. 2 men managed to force their way out and surrendered to Canadian troops nearby. They reported that 6 of their comrades were still inside the pillbox, dead, floating in the water. This was not unique to Strongpoint Albrecht. German after-action reports from the Passchendaele sector described dozens of pillboxes being abandoned due to flooding. Garrisons that refused to evacuate drowned when rising water made the positions uninhabitable. Medical officers attached to the Fourth Army noted cases of trench foot so severe that men's feet had begun to rot inside their boots. Some garrisons had been standing in water for weeks. A Marine Division report from late October describes a pillbox near Poelcapelle where the garrison had been isolated for 9 days. When relief troops finally reached the position, they found 3 men dead from exposure and drowning. The bodies were floating inside the pillbox. The survivors, 5 men, were delirious from cold and exhaustion. All 5 had advanced trench foot. 2 later required amputations. The German High Command recognized the impossibility of holding flooded positions. Orders issued on November 5th authorized unit commanders to abandon pillboxes that had become untenable due to water ingress. The orders acknowledged that many garrisons had already drowned or surrendered. The withdrawal was presented as a tactical adjustment. It was a retreat from the mud. The Royal Engineers, tasked with maintaining supply routes and rescuing trapped soldiers, faced conditions that made both missions suicidal. Duckboard tracks, the only means of crossing the swamp, required constant repair. Every night, engineer companies moved forward to replace shattered boards and extend the paths toward the front lines. Every night, German artillery targeted the tracks. Engineers died in the mud, trying to build roads that would last until morning. Captain R.G. Dixon, commanding a field company of the Royal Engineers attached to the Second Army, recorded the effort required to maintain a single duckboard track near Zonnebecker. The track was 800 yards long. It crossed a section of the battlefield that was entirely submerged. Maintenance crews worked every night from dusk until dawn. They carried replacement boards forward, walking single file along the existing track. German machine guns fired on them continuously. On the night of October 15th, Dixon's company lost 11 men attempting to repair a 100-yard section of track that had been destroyed by shellfire. The men were carrying boards across the mud when a barrage landed among them. Some were killed outright, others fell into the water. Dixon wrote, "We could hear them calling out in the darkness. We could not reach them. The mud was too deep and there was no solid ground to stand on. They drowned while we stood on the track, unable to help." Stretcher bearers encountered the same impossible conditions. Medical units attached to every division reported that wounded men were being left in shell holes because recovery was not feasible. The bearers could not carry a stretcher through waist-deep mud. They tried. Men died on the stretchers before they could be moved 50 yards. The bearers, exhausted from struggling through the swamp, collapsed alongside the wounded they were trying to save. Thomas Hope, a stretcher bearer with the 51st Division, described an attempt to recover a wounded officer near Polygon Wood. The officer had been hit by shrapnel and had fallen into a crater. He was conscious and able to give his position to a nearby patrol. 4 bearers set out to retrieve him. They reached the crater after 2 hours of wading through the mud. The officer was still alive, half submerged, clinging to the rim of the crater. The bearers lowered a stretcher into the water. They tried to lift the officer onto it. His clothing had absorbed water and mud. He weighed nearly 300 pounds. They could not lift him. They tried to pull him out by his arms. His tunic tore. They tied ropes around his chest and pulled again. The ropes cut into his skin. He screamed. They kept pulling. He slipped free and fell back into the water. Hope and the other bearers spent 30 minutes trying different methods. They attempted to build a ramp using boards scavenged from a nearby duckboard track. The boards sank into the mud. They tried to dig handholds into the side of the crater. The mud collapsed. The officer, weakening from blood loss and exposure, could no longer hold himself above the water. Hope wrote, "We had to leave him. He begged us not to go. We promised to return with better equipment. We never saw him again." Similar accounts appear in medical records from every division that fought at Passchendaele. The 3rd Canadian Division reported that over 40% of its casualties were never recovered from the battlefield. The Australian divisions reported higher percentages. Men wounded in shell holes drowned before help could arrive. Men trapped in the mud suffocated when the weight of their equipment pulled them under. Rescue attempts frequently resulted in additional casualties when the rescuers became trapped alongside the men they were trying to save. On November 2nd, a rescue team from the 4th Canadian Division attempted to save 3 soldiers trapped in a flooded crater near Crest Farm. The soldiers had been there for 6 hours. They were visible from a nearby observation post. A lieutenant organized a rescue party of 8 men. They carried ropes, boards, and a collapsible ladder. The rescue party reached the crater. They extended the ladder into the water. One of the trapped soldiers grabbed the ladder and began to climb. The ladder sank into the mud at the bottom of the crater. The soldier went under. He surfaced coughing. The rescuers pulled the ladder out and tried again, this time anchoring it to a duckboard. The soldier climbed again. He reached the top of the ladder. As he tried to step onto solid ground, the rim of the crater collapsed. He fell back into the water. The rescue team tried for 2 more hours. They could not extract any of the 3 men. German artillery began targeting the area. The lieutenant ordered his men to withdraw. All 3 soldiers drowned. Their bodies were never recovered. Medical officers at casualty clearing stations behind the Ypres salient began reporting unprecedented cases of psychological collapse in early November 1917. These were not the typical shell shock cases characterized by tremors, muteness, or dissociation. These were men who had become terrified of the ground itself. Captain J.C. Dunn, medical officer with the 2nd Battalion Royal Welch Fusiliers, documented cases of soldiers who refused to leave duckboard tracks even under direct fire. They would stand motionless on the boards while shells exploded around them, preferring death to stepping into the mud. Dunn described one private who had to be physically carried off a track by 4 men. The soldier fought them, screaming that the ground would swallow him. Similar cases appeared across all divisions fighting in the salient. Men developed what medical officers termed crater phobia. They could not approach shell holes, even empty ones. The sight of standing water caused panic attacks. Some soldiers became catatonic when ordered to advance across flooded ground. They sat down in the mud and refused to move, even when threatened with court-martial. Captain William Brown, a psychiatrist attached to the 5th Army Medical Staff, examined 43 cases of acute psychological breakdown between October 20th and November 15th. His notes describe soldiers who had witnessed comrades drown in shell holes and subsequently lost all capacity to function. One corporal, previously decorated for bravery, spent 3 days curled in a support trench, weeping and repeating the name of a private he had watched drown. The psychological impact extended beyond individual trauma. Entire units reported morale collapse. Battalion commanders described men who had fought without hesitation at the Somme or Vimy Ridge, now refusing to leave their trenches. The difference was the nature of the threat. Soldiers could accept death from bullets or shells. They could not accept drowning in mud, slowly, while their comrades watched helplessly. Lieutenant Colonel Agar Adamson, commanding the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, wrote in a letter to his wife dated November 8th, "The men are not afraid of the Germans. They are afraid of the ground. I have seen veterans with years of service break down weeping at the thought of going forward into that swamp. There is something about drowning in mud that destroys a man's courage in a way that enemy fire does not." German medical reports describe the same phenomenon among defending troops. A Bavarian division physician noted cases of soldiers who refused to leave their pillboxes even when ordered to withdraw. They preferred to remain in flooded concrete bunkers rather than wade through the swamp to reach safer positions. The doctor attributed this to pathological terror of the mud, developed after weeks of watching enemy soldiers drown in the craters around their positions. The terror was not irrational. The mud at Passchendaele killed in ways that defied a soldier's training. There was no defense against it. Courage meant nothing. Strength meant nothing. A man could survive years in the trenches, endure countless barrages, charge machine guns, and then die struggling in a shell hole 4 feet deep, unable to climb out, because the mud held him like concrete. The psychological reports from Passchendaele reveal a common theme. Men could endure visible threats. They could face an enemy they could see and fight. The mud was invisible. It was everywhere. It gave no warning. A soldier could step off a duckboard and sink into a crater hidden beneath the surface. He would drown in minutes, sometimes seconds, while the men beside him could do nothing but watch. By mid-November 1917, the battlefield at Passchendaele had become a cemetery without graves. Thousands of bodies lay in the mud, most of them submerged in shell holes, invisible from the surface. Burial parties could not function. The ground was too unstable to dig proper graves. Bodies placed in shallow scrapes disappeared within days, pulled down by the mud or obliterated by fresh shell fire. The missing lists from Third Ypres reveal the scale of the disappearances. The Canadian Corps alone reported over 4,000 men missing during the battle for Passchendaele Ridge. The Australian Imperial Force listed approximately 3,300 missing from the August attacks. British divisions recorded similar figures. Missing did not mean captured. German records show that fewer than 200 Commonwealth soldiers were taken prisoner during the entire Third Ypres offensive. Missing meant lost in the mud. Chaplains attached to burial details submitted reports describing the impossibility of recovering bodies. Reverend Ernest Cross, serving with the 48th Division, recorded an attempt to bury 15 men killed near Polygon Wood. The burial party reached the location where the bodies had been seen. The bodies were gone. The ground had absorbed them. Cross wrote, "We found only their helmets and equipment lying on the surface of the mud. The men themselves had sunk. We marked the spot with crosses, but we buried nothing. The mud at Passchendaele was not simply wet earth. Chemical analysis conducted after the war showed that the soil in the Ypres salient contained high concentrations of clay. When saturated with water, clay forms a suspension that behaves like quicksand. Objects placed on the surface sink gradually. The weight of a human body, combined with the weight of military equipment, caused soldiers to submerge at a rate medical officers estimated at approximately 1 inch per hour. A corpse lying in a shell hole filled with mud would disappear completely within 2 to 3 days. Witnesses reported seeing bodies sink in real time. Private Fraser recorded watching a dead soldier lying on the edge of a crater near Passchendaele village. He passed the spot in the morning. The body was fully visible. He returned in the afternoon. Only the man's shoulders and head remained above the surface. By evening, the body was gone. This process occurred across the entire battlefield. Thousands of men who died at Passchendaele were never buried because they had already been consumed by the ground before burial parties could reach them. The earth reclaimed them. Their bodies became part of the soil. Subsequent artillery fire churned the mud, mixing human remains with clay and water until distinction was impossible. Identification of the dead became nearly impossible. Bodies recovered from shell holes had often been submerged for days or weeks. Decomposition was accelerated by the water. Faces were unrecognizable. Identity discs were missing or illegible. Many bodies were recovered without heads or limbs, blown apart by shells or torn apart by the force of drowning in the mud. Burial officers recorded them as unknown British soldier or unknown Canadian soldier and moved on. The Tyne Cot Cemetery near Passchendaele contains 11,961 Commonwealth burials. Of these, 8,373 are unidentified. The headstones read, "Known unto God." Most of these men were recovered from the mud months or years after the battle. Many were never recovered at all. The Menin Gate Memorial in Ypres lists 54,896 missing soldiers from the Ypres salient who have no known grave. A significant percentage of them died at Passchendaele, swallowed by the mud. German burial records show similar losses. The Fourth Army reported over 5,000 missing during the defense of Passchendaele. Most were garrison troops killed in pillboxes or soldiers who drowned attempting to move between positions. German burial parties, operating under the same impossible conditions as Commonwealth forces, could not recover the majority of bodies. They remain in the ground. Passchendaele Ridge was captured on November 10, 1917. The Canadian Corps held a line of shattered pillboxes and flooded shell holes along a low rise that gave minimal tactical advantage. The cost had been catastrophic. Commonwealth casualties for Third Ypres exceeded 300,000 men. German casualties were estimated at 260,000. Thousands of those casualties were never found. The mud retained them. When the war ended and the Ypres salient was abandoned, the battlefield remained a swamp. Farmers who returned to the area in 1919 found their land unrecognizable. Fields had become lakes. Drainage systems were destroyed beyond repair. The soil was contaminated with chemicals, shrapnel, and human remains. Reconstruction took decades. During the reconstruction, workers discovered bodies constantly. Skeletons emerged from the mud during excavation work. Skulls surfaced in ploughed fields. Femurs and ribs appeared in drainage ditches. The remains were collected and buried in Commonwealth war cemeteries, usually without identification. The discovery of bodies continued through the 1920s, the 1930s, the post-World War II period, and into the present century. In 1998, a Belgian farmer ploughing a field near Passchendaele village struck a layer of bones 3 feet beneath the surface. Archaeologists excavated the site and discovered the remains of 17 soldiers, likely from a Canadian battalion, lying in what had been a shell hole. The bones were mixed with equipment, ammunition, and fragments of uniform. DNA analysis was attempted but proved inconclusive. The remains were buried at Tyne-Cot Cemetery as unknown soldiers. Similar discoveries occur regularly. Construction projects in the Ypres area routinely unearth human remains. In 2004, the expansion of a highway near Zonnebeke required archaeological surveys. The surveys identified over 60 burial sites, most of them shell holes containing multiple bodies. The remains were exhumed and reburied. Most could not be identified. The Passchendaele Museum in Belgium displays artifacts recovered from the battlefield, including equipment, weapons, and personal items found alongside human remains. Buttons, cigarette cases, letters, photographs, the debris of lives ended in the mud. The museum's collection grows yearly as farmers and construction workers continue finding these objects in the soil. The ground at Passchendaele is still giving up its dead over a century later. Archaeologists working in the region estimate that thousands of bodies remain unrecovered, buried too deep for casual excavation, their exact locations lost. The mud absorbed them in 1917 and has held them since. Shell holes that claimed men's lives filled in over the decades, but the bodies stayed where they fell, 6 feet down, 8 feet down, deeper in some cases, suspended in clay. The battlefield itself has changed, the swamp drained, the craters filled, grass grew over the killing ground. Villages were rebuilt, roads were paved, but beneath the surface, the mud still contains fragments of the men who fought there. Farmers ploughing fields occasionally strike metal, a helmet, a rifle barrel, a belt buckle, and know there is likely a body nearby. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains records of soldiers still listed as missing from Passchendaele. The list contains over 42,000 names from Third Ypres alone. Some of these men died elsewhere in the salient. Many died in the mud near Passchendaele Ridge and were never seen again. Their families received telegrams informing them their sons, husbands, fathers were missing in action. Missing meant the army had lost them. The mud had taken them, and the mud kept them. This was the unique horror of Passchendaele, not simply that men died, but that they died by drowning in earth, slowly, visibly, while others watched and could not help. The battlefield was not a place where soldiers fought and fell. It was a place where the ground itself became the enemy, where gravity and water conspired to pull men down into liquid soil that would not release them. They struggled, they called out, they reached for help, and they sank beneath the surface. Their names went on memorials because there were no bodies to bury. The mud of Passchendaele killed more men than bullets in some sectors. It killed them slowly. It gave them time to understand they were dying. It gave their comrades time to try rescue attempts that always failed. And when the men were gone, the mud kept their bodies, held them for decades, for a century, and continues holding them now. The battlefield became a grave that has no borders, no markers, no ceremony, just soil that remembers.